Hello, my name is Julie, and today I'm wrapping up all the books I read in July. So if you haven't watched my last couple of vlogs, welcome to my brand new apartment, place I'll be living for at least probably the next 2 years. I'm still kind of figuring out backgrounds and lighting and everything because even though it's very sunny outside, this shadowy area seems to be the best I can do at the moment. So in July, at the very beginning, I moved into my new apartment, and a couple of weeks later, I started my first full-time actual job out of college. I'm working in my industry at a place that's pretty cool, so I'm happy with that. Currently happy with the job, but that does mean I'm very tired all of the time now because I'm still adjusting to that schedule. So while I felt like I didn't get as much reading done, that's because it was only like the last week or so. Meanwhile, I actually tied for most books read in a month this year, and I did read more pages than any other month this year. Let's go through my monthly stats. I read 13 books this month. That is the same that I read in June. I read 5,622 pages. That's gotta be the most amount of pages I've read in a month. My average rating was a 3.8. Number of 5 stars, I have a 0, but I did have a couple of like 4.5 stars that maybe could get boosted up to a 5. My average page count was 432 pages a book, which is longer than average, with average pages per day at 181, which is higher than average, makes sense, but Friendathon has a little bit to do with that. I read 8 books from my shelf. I added 2 books to my shelf, did no on hauls, so now my annual net TBR shelf is -1. Cannot believe I did that. We've got about an equal balance of fantasy, mystery thriller, and general fiction with 1 romance book. Star ratings, we've got a whole ton of 4 stars. I read mostly physical books, which makes sense. I have moved away from my old public library. And then demographics, this is pretty consistent across the months. I read a quarter young adult. So let's get into the books that I read. So the first book that I read was Notes on an Execution by Danya Kokovka. This is a general fiction book that I saw everywhere at the end of last year, and a lot of people that I don't necessarily watch all the time, but when I was binging the best books of 2022, this kept coming up. So this is about a serial killer who is on death row, and we follow him on the day of his death. But we also follow his life through the eyes of 3 women who were affected by his life. We have his mother who gave him up to foster care when he was young. We have a girl who was in the foster care system with him and interacted with him as a kid, but now is tracking him down as he has committed these murders as a police investigator. And we also have his former sister-in-law who is seeing his marriage from the outside. We flip back and forth between the final day of Ansel Packer's life and also a chronological account between all of these women of what his life was like from the outside. I just thought that this was a really interestingly told story, even if it didn't fully hit me like other people had said. I think that what had been hyped up about this book is how it talked about the death penalty and how serial killers are glamorized and everything. And I don't think that those things were actually that prevalent in the book. There was a very short scene that we talk about how the victims of this man will never get the same attention that he does. But that was like one scene. I do think that this was a like net positive book of showing like a 3-dimensional view of this man's life, that like even though there are people who saw him in a positive light, there are still these terrible things that he did. I got through this book really quickly. I definitely wanted to find out what was happening next, and I do think that this did a good job of, even though we know exactly how the story is going to end, we know he's going to end up being caught and he's going to be put on death row. We don't know exactly how it got there, and I really liked how there were still mysteries to solve. So I ended up giving this a 4-star. It wasn't the perfect general fiction. I wish it went a little bit further in its commentary, but I did enjoy it. Then for my 12 books from 12 friends in 12 months challenge, I read All My Rage by Saba Tahir. So this is a general fiction YA book. This is about two Pakistani American teenagers, Sal and Noor. They have been best friends since they were young, but about a year ago, Noor confessed that she had feelings for Sal, and that split up their friendship, even though Sal actually does have feelings for Noor. And the two of them come back together after they have some shared grief. They're both in really hard times in their life, but Sal's mother has just passed away. Sal is trying to run his mother's hotel, which was her dream, and he's really struggling for money, and he might have to turn to some not so legal ways to get it. And then we have Noor, who really wants to go to college, wants to get out of here, wants to be active in the Muslim community, but her uncle, who is her guardian, who saved her from literally dying in Pakistan, does not appreciate her, only wants her to run the liquor store that he runs, and might be harming her in ways that she doesn't outwardly express. I thought that these characters were so well developed. I really loved a lot of the language that was used. It's such a heart-wrenching book of these characters' journeys. They are constantly hiding how they feel from everybody around them, and they're having to deal with a lot of shit thrown at them, and it's really terrible. There's so many great conversations about the immigrant family identity and how so many things that come with that are swept under the rug because you're family and you're supposed to support each other no matter what. I really adored Noor. I thought Sal was good, but the amount that he lied, I was like, I know that you're not this person. I would say the thing that would take me out of this book is whenever the author tried to be lighthearted and a character would try to make a joke, it didn't feel natural. It didn't feel like a thing that an actual person would say. Meanwhile, when we have all these sad things, it feels very real. But this coming of age story, I really loved. I thought that this was plotted and paced very well, and I really liked how the ending handled all of the bad stuff that happened, how people do get out of the bad situations, but if you do bad things, you are punished. I gave this a very solid 4-star. I would recommend this very, very highly, especially to the YA audience it's meant for. The next 7 books that I read are all going to be my Friendathon books. If you want to see me read all those and give you my entire full thoughts, go watch my vlog, but I'm going to run through these books very quickly. The first one that I read was The Diviners by Libba Bray. This is a book set in the 1920s in New York. Our main character, Evie, moves there after shaking up things in her hometown, and she has a power that she hasn't told anyone about, that she can read objects when she touches them. So she can learn more about the person who owned the object. And there is a murder that her uncle, who runs an occult museum, is asked to help with, and she ends up going along and her powers can help. I loved how this blended historical fiction with horror and a little bit of fantasy. It was, I think fantasy or more of the magic will come in the future books, but I absolutely loved the horror elements of this. It felt a little bit Stephen King, in how we have a bad guy slowly picking off people one by one to gather dark power. I absolutely loved it. I have DNF'd this book 2 times in the past, and I think it has to do with the physical book, but the audiobook is narrated by the author, and she does so many voices and accents that are done so well, so I absolutely recommend doing this series through audiobook instead of the physical book, no matter how absolutely gorgeous this copy is. I mean, come on. So this was another 4-star for me. Then I read Icebreaker by Hannah Grace. This is a romance book about a figure skater, Anastasia, who is wanting to be on the Olympics, but she's having trouble with her partner, who has been a friend of hers for a very long time, but he is really bad for her mental health. And a hockey player, the captain of the hockey team at their university, Nate, who is trying to keep his team all together. One of the ice rinks ends up getting destroyed, so the two have to skate at the same time, so the teams start intermingling, and the two of them, even though Anastasia says she hates Nate, they start having an attraction for each other. I was so excited for this book because I really like hockey. I want to love one of these TikTok romances, but guess what? This was not it. The good things, I really liked the representation of therapy and how helpful it can be. I liked that there is a wheelchair-bound character who has just as much fun as everybody else and has a girlfriend and everyone loves him. Other than that, I thought this was so poorly done. There were a couple of spicy scenes that I did like, maybe earlier in the book, but there were some weird freaking choices that really icked me out. This was really poorly edited. I thought the pacing was really bad, where we just have like an order of events that don't really make a lot of sense when it comes to like story structure. And there was so much of this that could have been cut out. This did not need to be 450 pages. This could have been 250. This was a total flop for me. I gave it a 2-star because it wasn't problematic, but no. Then I read Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfeld. This is a literary horror about two women who are married. Leah's a marine biologist and she is sent on a routine submarine investigation. They're going to be under the sea for like 3 weeks. She ends up going missing for 6 months before the crew returns. And Miri, her wife, thinks her wife is dead, essentially, and when she comes back at the very beginning of this book, there's something wrong with Leah. She won't eat, she's not talking, she's just not herself, and she keeps like turning the faucets on in the bathtub, staying in the bath for a long time, staring at the water, and Miri is just trying to figure out what happened to her wife along with getting no information. I wish I knew going into this book that very, very little happens in this book. It is short, but it is a lot of pages of people thinking about things and like not a lot actually going on. I wanted more plot. I wanted more actual descriptions of what things looked like. I just needed a more visceral experience from this than what I got. This book is just one giant metaphor, and I do think it does that commentary very well. And I just think that this book has been a little bit misadvertised. So I would go in knowing those things, and I think you'll like it more. I wanted it to lean into the weird and still say the things that it did. So I ended up giving this a 3.5. Definitely didn't do anything wrong. It just wasn't what I was expecting. Then I read A Man Called Ove, I forget how to pronounce this name. After consulting the internet, I think I've been saying this name wrong. It's A Man Called Uva. I don't know, I don't speak this language, and I'm so sorry, Frederick Bachman, but I love your books. This is about Ova, who is a 55-year-old man who is kind of feeling like he's been put out to pasture. A lot of things have been going wrong for him, and he is starting to think about taking his own life. And then things keep getting in the way of him doing that. New neighbors move in next door to him and start shaking up everything in the neighborhood. We follow him in the present, but we also flip back to his past when he was a child, when he was a young man, when he met his wife and their life together. And I just thought this was a wonderful character-led book. As you go along, you see how caring he is, and loving and helpful and stubborn in the best way, and how he doesn't even want to admit to himself that that's how he is. And I absolutely adored this book. The ending left me a little emotionally distraught, but in a good way, in a well-constructed way. So I absolutely recommend this. I don't know if I liked this or Beartown more. They are very different tones, but they're still very well-constructed books. So absolutely love this. Gave this a 4.5 at the moment. It could go up to a 5, who knows? Then I read The Man Who Died Twice by Richard Bachman. This is the second book in the Thursday Murder Club series, which is about 4 septuagenarians living in a retirement community. And every Thursday they have been coming together to look at cold cases in the area and try to solve them themselves. But in the first book, a crime happens at their retirement facility, so they decide to investigate it themselves. And this book, it is the Thursday afterwards. One of our main characters, who is a former MI5 agent, her ex-husband reaches out to her, says he's in hiding. Even though he is an MI6 agent, he is definitely going to need some help because he might have pissed off some international crime people. Our four main characters are going to do their best to try to figure out who has a ton of diamonds. I thought this book was fun and funny, and I really loved returning to these characters. I thought that the plot I was less invested in until the end of it because it felt kind of separated from our characters. But as the book went along, I had more and more fun. I loved seeing these characters outwit criminals. Should I call him Richard Bachman? Richard Bachman is Stephen King's pseudonym. This is by Richard Osman. Richard Osman is such a fun and funny and clever guy that I can't wait to continue on in this series. And I've heard that book 3 is the best one yet. Then I read The Gilded Wolves by Roshani Chokshi. This is a beginning of a YA historical fantasy trilogy where there's heists. There's a magical underground going on in 1800s Paris, where we have the Order of Babel, which is all these magical families who have different houses of power. And one of our main characters, Sauron, was supposed to be the heir of one of these houses. When his father died, he was supposed to take over, but that was taken away from him, and he was put into different abusive households. And now that he's older, the Order of Babel actually comes to him and is like, hey, we will give you your rightful power if you hunt down this artifact for us. So he gets his already established found family group together, who are a bunch of teenagers who are experts in different fields, to do a heist. I thought that this was super fun. It definitely gave Six of Crow vibes, particularly in the main romantic plot. And I really liked how our main characters interacted with each other. I definitely could have paid more attention to the audiobook, but the male narrator was so bad. The female narrator did a great job, and the ending really took me for a loop. Very excited to continue on with this series and hopefully pay attention a little bit more. But I gave this around a 3.75 or 4. Fun times. Then for our buddy read, we ended up reading The Bone Shard Daughter by Andrea Stewart. It is about this world where there were these godlike creatures that used to rule the world, but then some powerful families of humans found out that you could use shards of bone from humans and from animals to create these things called constructs that you could basically encode with what you wanted them to do, and ended up overthrowing those godlike creatures. And now there is an empire run by that family. One of our main characters, Lynn, is his daughter. And since she lost her memory years ago, he has not trusted her and doesn't want her to have the throne. And so she is trying to learn his bone shard magic so that she can earn his favor, but also kind of overthrow him. This book did not impress me. I thought that each of our different perspectives felt so different from each other, even though they were in the same world, that it did not feel like a really cohesive whole. Lynn felt very classic YA. You know exactly where her story is going. You know everything before she does. The foreshadowing is done so blatantly that it's like, is Lynn stupid? Jovis is a really fun character who's a smuggler. He gives Flynn Rider vibes. We have a couple that we follow that was really annoying to follow, and then one character who we see a couple of times who's really interesting. I just feel like this book is going to immediately fall out of my mind. There wasn't really any plot twists that I couldn't tell what the plot twist was going to be about. Even if I couldn't guess exactly what the answer was going to be, I just felt everything coming. This was a 3-star for me. Definitely a letdown, and I don't think that I'm going to be continuing on in the series just because I didn't have enough investment in the people and the world. Then I cannot believe I'm saying this to you, but I was very kindly sent by Tor a copy of He Who Drowned the World by Shelley Parker Chan early. I cannot believe I have this in my hands. This is the sequel to She Who Became the Sun, which is a fantasy retelling of the founding of the Ming Dynasty. Our main character is Zhu, who is born a girl and takes over her brother's identity when he dies. He has been prophesized to bring about greatness, and she takes that identity and fucking runs with it. She will stop at nothing to achieve greatness because she so devoutly believes that it is her destiny. We also have Oyang, who is the other main character in that book, who is a eunuch general. So both of these characters are in a weird position with their gender of not really falling into the gender binary and having to deal with that on a daily basis. In the finale to this series, we follow a bunch of people who are all vying for power and the throne of the empire to finally unite China. If the first book is about suffering and then taking your greatness after suffering, this is about taking greatness and then suffering for it. There are so many terrible things that happen in this book. So many of these characters are terrible people, but somehow we also get like three-dimensional pictures of them so that there are parts of them that you really empathize with and you feel bad for them. Madame Zhang comes to mind, but I thought that this did a lot of great discussions about these characters and the immense amount of influence that they have over the world and how much they're having to sacrifice for that. And how having a separation from your own identity because of the expectations that society has on you can wreak catastrophic havoc. My main critiques from this book that I think made me like this book a little bit less than the first book was that Zhu is not as much of a focal point. I did really like the other perspectives that we saw, but I was so invested in Zhu as a character in the first book that like stepping away from her this much comparatively felt like we were like losing ties almost with the first book. Especially because my favorite character in the series, Ma, is only like relevant at the very end of the book. She only does anything at the very end, and I'm like, where are you? And I'm so sorry. Anyway, I am definitely giving this a very strong 4-star. I think this is such a strong duology, and Shelley Parker Chan has a very long career ahead of them. If you love the Poppy War, I think you're going to adore this series. Then for my book club, 3 of Clubs, for this quarter, we are reading Greek mythology retellings. If you would like to join us next month, in August, we are reading Ariadne. You still have time to join us, and we are currently voting on what our September book is going to be. So please go ahead to the Discord to help us vote. But in July, we read 1,000 Ships by Natalie Haynes. This has been on this shelf for years, and I have been meaning to read it for so long, putting it off, and I'm so glad that I finally forced myself and everybody else to read it because this book is fucking fantastic. This is a retelling of the Trojan War and its causes and after effects, all of the myths that have to do with the Trojan War, but is told through the perspectives of only women. I think that this is so well done, partially because of its construction. So we start the book with the fall of Troy, following Aeneas's abandoned wife as she sees the fires burning and ends up being consumed in flames. And then we follow 2 timelines. One of the timelines, we follow the aftermath of the Trojan War in chronological order, from the Greeks taking over the city to where all of the women are sent afterwards. We see Hecabe, we see Cassandra, we see Clytemnestra, and we also see Penelope, Odysseus's wife, writing letters to him as she is being told about all of his adventures over the 10 years that he spends away from home. And in the other timeline, we follow a little bit of the war and the lead up to the Trojan War in reverse chronological order, which is so fascinating. So we start with the fall of Troy, and then we go to the Trojan horse, and then we go to Achilles' death, and then we have Briseis being taken away from Achilles, and he ends up leaving the war. And then we see Helen being taken away from Greece, And then we see all of the different mythological causes for why the war had to happen. I thought that Natalie Haynes did a beautiful job of constructing all of these women that felt very real, even though they are mythological. They are going through horrific, terrible things done to them by all of the men in this story that are just swept under the rug. All the men are being touted as heroes, even though they treat their women terribly and they are enslaving women, raping women. And I thought that this did a very poignant job of showing the terrible things. I just absolutely adored this. I've heard really glowing things from the people who have read this in the club, so I absolutely cannot recommend this enough. I guess I should be giving this a 5-star. Even more unbelievably to me, I got my hands on an Arc of Rouge by Mona Awad. If you don't know, Mona Awad is one of, if not my favorite author who's currently writing. Bonnie, her book is my favorite book of all time, tied with Pride and Prejudice. This has been my most anticipated book of the year, so I absolutely had to read it. This is about Belle, who is obsessed with skincare and taking care of her skin and looking youthful, which is partially handed down to her by her mother, who's white. Belle is half Egyptian. She didn't know her father, and she is, of course, darker skinned than her mother, and she has internalized that in a way that is really unhealthy. And when her mother unexpectedly dies, she ends up going to take care of all the business that needs to be wrapped up, and she ends up somehow at this haunting, magical spa cult that says it's going to make her be her most magnificent self that her mother also attended before she died and started acting weird. Plot-wise and tonally, this does feel similar to Mona Awad's other 2 horror books. Unfortunately, I did not love this as much as I loved Bunny and All's Well. It was really hard for me to pin down what didn't necessarily work well for me. I'm giving this a 4-star. Let me start out there. But the other 2 books that I've read from her have been immediate 5 stars from the very beginning. The writing style relied a lot on repetition and maybe like gimmicks. They make sense in terms of what the plot of the book is, but they didn't necessarily transport me into the main character's head like the other books did. I think this does a very good job of talking about the beauty industry and how it can damage someone's self-image and therefore themselves and their actual identity. And I think this says a lot about whiteness and being of mixed race identity. I did really like a lot of the imagery and like the haunting kind of gothic nature of this. My favorite part of this book by a long shot was the very ending. I loved seeing the resurface at the end. I thought that was so good and really summed up the nature of the book. Even though that this didn't work as much as the other ones did for me, this was still really enjoyable. Absolutely recommend Mona Awad, and this will be coming out September 12th if you want to go check it out. And then the last book that I read in July was The Fires of Heaven by Robert Jordan. This is the 5th book in the Wheel of Time, and let me tell you, I didn't think that I was going to be continuing in this series after book 4. I just didn't have a good time with it, but I have decided from here on out I am only going to be listening to the audiobooks because I have had a significantly better experience with the audiobooks than I have reading these physically. So, Wheel of Time, classic fantasy series about in every age, all the souls are recycled and reborn, and there is a great evil that is going to come and try to take over the world. And there's one prophesized person who is going to be able to take them down with their forces, known as the Dragon Reborn, who is our main character, Rand. And there's a lot of players going on in this book. I really loved the Aes Sedai politics that we saw. I loved seeing Swan, who has been consistently one of my favorite characters in this series. For some reason, I still love Nynaeve. I don't understand why. I liked a lot of seeing Teleran Riyadh and the Dream World. For once in this series, I finally like a romantic setup, and that's Rand and Aviendha. I actually do really like their dynamic. The same problems that I have with this series in the past are going to continue into these books. It is absolutely shocking that Robert Jordan has ever met a human woman. let alone be married to one for his entire life, let alone her being his editor. How did she let this get by? The amount of talk about boobs and people looking at other people's chests, the men being like, oh, I don't understand women, and women being like, oh, I don't understand men. There's a conversation that you could have about it being like a narrative choice from this world where women and men have been so split apart from each other. But let me remind you that it is called the one power. I don't think that that was the intention. At this level of repetition, I do believe that it is Robert Jordan's own belief that men and women, like it is the men are from Mars, women are from Venus mentality that I absolutely cannot stand. But there was a lot to like when it came to the plot and the development of this world and this series. I really loved the element of balefire. I really loved seeing Matt be a reluctant hero and not wanting to be this great general that he's essentially been bestowed with this great knowledge. I'm always going to have mixed feelings about this series, but this is the best that I have felt about this series in a hot minute. So I will be continuing. I am going to try to power through all of it, but I am going to be doing the audiobooks. These are all of the books that I read in July. Let me know what you read in July. If you've read any of these books, do you have any books to recommend me based on what I liked in here? Did you have any books that you read this month that you think that I would like? Because I'd love to talk about books, obviously. If you would like to follow me anywhere, my link is in the description. Thank you so much for watching this very long ranty video, and as always, I will see you in the next one.